FRK 3-to-1 earnings per share continued, diluted earnings per share. A company can issue an instrument which is convertible into ordinary shares in the future. It could be something like a debenture, convertible debenture, or convertible preference share. And while this instrument is an issue, we now have potential ordinary shares, as they can potentially be converted into ordinary shares at a future date. And they can also cause dilution of our earnings per share, because once they are issued, there will be a larger number of ordinary shares in issue, and that could possibly cause that our basic earnings is now lower per share. A potential ordinary share is a financial instrument which may give the holder thereof an entitlement to ordinary shares. And diluted earnings per share, why do we calculate that? To show the investors the effect of this future conversion on the current basic earnings per share. That's the whole reason that this diluted earnings per share will be disclosed. Now, basic earnings and the diluted earnings per share must be disclosed from the date of that the convertible instrument has been issued. So from that date, when it's issued as a convertible debenture or a convertible preference share, from that date onwards, we have to calculate both EPS and diluted EPS. The potential ordinary shares, in other words, this instrument, we will calculate how many are the potential shares that we can be converted into, and they will then be included in the calculation of the diluted earnings per share from the date of issue to the date of conversion. Depending on date of issue, when in the year, etc., when in the year the conversion took place, you will have to wait it for that period. But after conversion, in other words, after it has been converted, the potential instrument is now an ordinary share because it's converted, and it will be classified as such and then included in the basic earnings per share. For example, if you have convertible preference shares, so if they are issued here, the 31st of December, there, 20.5, they will run until the 30th of June 20.7. And during that period, there will be potential ordinary shares, and during that period, they will then cause dilution, and we have to calculate that. After that date, once it's converted, it is now ordinary shares. It's part of our shares issued, and therefore, it will be part of the basic earnings calculation. That is what we want to achieve there. Calculation. Basic earnings, as we did before. Profit for the year attributable to the ordinary shares, and divided that by the weighted average number of shares, the WANOS, gives you basic earnings per share. But for diluted earnings per share, you have to adjust the profit. Because remember, that convertible debenture carried interest. And if you don't have the debenture anymore, you don't have to pay the interest anymore. So you have a saving on that expense. The other thing to remember, you have to do the calculation after tax. So if it is taxable, tax-deductible interest, you can then calculate the after tax. If it is something like a convertible preference share, they of course don't have tax. It's just the dividend that you have to take into account. But also remember, for diluted EPS, the weighted average number of shares must be adjusted to include these additional shares, because that is the whole purpose of this exercise, to see what will happen once these shares have been issued. Our general rule for convertible instruments, such as convertible debentures and convertible preference shares, are as follows. We have to adjust the basic earnings with the savings of interest or the saving of the dividend. That will not be necessary if the instrument was converted. In other words, with the debenture, because the debenture is converted into an ordinary share, there will not be interest on that debenture anymore. So that will be a saving, of course, after tax. If it's a convertible preference share, then that preference dividend will not be necessary anymore, and we can add that back as well. And that is what we're saying here. Convertible debentures, add back the after-tax interest, and with a convertible preference share, the preference dividend is not deducted. But we'll have a look at that calculation in detail. Also, remember, when these shares is converted, as we say, it is potential shares in the future. So when they are converted in the future, there will be more shares in issue. And that is why you will have to take the number of shares that would be issued if the instrument is converted, and that will have to be added to the normal shares that's currently in issue. And that will give us the adjusted WANOS for our dilution calculation. Happy with that? But you can also have dilution when there's options taken out. So what does an option do? A person buys an option or gets an option, depending, from the company, and this option will say that they are allowed to buy shares at a certain value at a future date. Now, if that value that they are purchasing at is lower than the market value, it may cause dilution. Now, because it's an option, there's no interest or dividends or anything that is attached to that. So for that reason, your basic earnings will not be adjusted. But, as we just explained, there's a possibility that you will purchase these shares, you'll pay an amount for it, but it may not be the full amount. Then you have a portion that was issued for value, and you will have some of the shares that was issued for no value. Very, very similar to a rights issue. And that is what we now have to do. We have to calculate the number of shares that would be issued if we issue it at the fair value at that stage. And then we compare that to the total number of shares that this option will give this person, deduct the amount you just calculated that would be issued at value, and the difference would be the portion that was issued at no value. This is an exception to the rule, but now we only take that portion which was issued for no value, and that because that is the portion that will cause the dilution. Remember, the one that was issued for value should not cause the dilution because the company receives the amount that the share is worth. But the portion that was issued at no value, that portion will now cause the dilution, and that is why we have to do that calculation. Now, if a share is anti-dilutive, what do we mean by that? Anti-dilutive is that it actually causes to be a positive, that if those shares are converted from the one instrument to another, that it is a positive influence on the earnings, then it can be anti-dilutive. But we have to disclose this instrument that could potentially still have a basic EPS the diluted EPS in future, even though in the current year it was not included in the dilution because it had an anti-dilutive effect. Bottom line, disclose it. The dilutive instrument issued in the current year, we must also report as if it was issued last year as well, even though the basic EPS is equal to the basic EPS. Now we have to do class example 3, 4, and 5. Let us just have a summary of what we just said. We looked at convertible debentures, convertible preference shares, and options. Now when you have a convertible debenture, it will cause dilution, and therefore we must calculate diluted earnings. The basic earnings must be adjusted with the interest saving to get the adjusted earnings for dilution. And as we said, because when this item has been converted into ordinary shares, there will now be more ordinary shares in issue. We will have to do that calculation. Add those shares. If they've been issued during the year or converted during the year, then of course we will have to apply weighting as well. But no restatement. And the same happens with preference shares. But let's just remember one thing, how that basic earnings is calculated. The convertible preference share can cause dilution, and now we want to adjust the basic earnings. When we try to calculate basic earnings, we have to take the earnings per the profit and loss, deduct the preference dividend, and that will give us the basic earnings, which we will use for our basic earnings per share. So if we want to add that back, add the preference dividend back so that we can have the adjusted earnings for the dilution, then we're on the right track. Please make sure that you understand that calculation there clearly. Then the WANOS, exactly the same as we said previously. Because there's new shares issued, we have to adjust the WANOS with the number of new shares and weight it where necessary. On the last slide, the options. As we said previously, there's no interest, there's no dividend, so the basic earnings for dilution stays the same, unchanged. But when you have to calculate the WANOS, as we said previously, you have to calculate those shares that were issued, that are going to be issued for no value. And they are the shares that you will take into account for your diluted earnings per share. Right, thank you. Have a look at class example 3, 4, and 5 at this stage.